The coronavirus pandemic continues to ravage the globe, with nearly 38,000 known deaths and close to 800,000 confirmed cases. Here in the United States, the death toll has topped 3,100, meaning more Americans have now died from COVID-19 than from 9/11 terror attacks. Nearly 520 of those deaths were reported Monday, the highest number in a single day so far in the United States. 3/4 of American residents are now under stay-at-home orders. That's over 250 million people, as people in at least 31 states, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, have been told by officials to stay home except for necessities or if they provide essential services. Some states have resisted such moves, though, including Missouri, where Republican Governor Mike Parson has denied pleas from across the state's medical community to issue a stay-at-home order, even as the state's coronavirus cases recently topped 1,000. Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. enacted their shelter-in-place orders Monday, with D.C. and Maryland residents subject to hefty fines and imprisonment for violating the strict measures. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease expert and a member of President Trump's coronavirus task force, said Monday another coronavirus outbreak in the fall is likely, but that the nation would be better equipped to handle it. On Monday, President Trump boasted 1 million people in the United States have been tested for coronavirus, weeks after he vowed to hit that number within days. In a conference call with governors, Trump suggested there was no longer a problem with a lack of test kits, despite repeated calls for more tests around the country. Montana Governor Steve Bullock said his state was 1 day away from running out of tests. Other governors, including J.B. Pritzker of Illinois and Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, have called out the administration's handling of the crisis and the severe shortages in medical equipment and personal protective equipment. Trump has also boasted about the government's ability to produce ventilators and said the U.S. would be able to send a surplus to other nations in need, as doctors and nurses around the United States say their hospitals need them here. During an interview on Fox and Friends Monday, President Trump celebrated the fact that the $2.2 trillion stimulus package left out provisions by Democrats in earlier versions of the bill that would have expanded voting access.
If you look at before and after, the things they had in there were crazy. They had things, levels of voting that if you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again.
In New Jersey, a nursing home is on lockdown after a COVID-19 outbreak killed at least 8 people and infected many others. Last week, nearly 100 residents at the nursing home in Woodbridge, New Jersey, were evacuated from the facility after 24 people tested positive for the coronavirus, and all residents were presumed to be infected. Clusters of coronavirus cases have been observed at nursing homes around the country, including in Maryland, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. As cases surge in the state of New York, the epicenter of the outbreak in the United States, some nurses say they've been pressured to return to work despite having COVID-19 symptoms. Meanwhile, New York Congressmember Nydia Velázquez announced Monday she's tested positive. She said, quote, presumed coronavirus infection. She said she likely has a mild case but experienced muscle aches, fevers, nasal congestion, and stomach upset, and that she lost the ability to smell or taste food. Congressmember Velázquez spoke on the House floor and stood alongside House Speaker Nancy Pelosi last Friday during the signing of the coronavirus stimulus bill. In more news from New York City, public transit passengers are calling out dangerously crowded subways and buses as the Metropolitan Transportation Authority has reduced service in response to a drop in ridership during the pandemic. The MTA announced over the past week that 7 workers have died due to complications from COVID-19. Over 300 cases of coronavirus infection have been confirmed among MTA employees. That that number expected to be far higher if more tests were available. As cases surge in the state of New York, the epicenter of the outbreak here in the United States, some nurses say they've been pressured to return to work having COVID-19 symptoms. And again, Nydia Velasquez said that she tested positive for labor rights advocates are condemning Amazon for firing a warehouse worker who organized a strike at its Staten Island facility Monday. The fired worker, Chris Smalls, and dozens of other workers walked out to demand more protective measures and that Amazon close and sanitize the warehouse after multiple coworkers tested positive for COVID-19. This is an Amazon worker speaking Monday from the walkout.
And I'm doing this because of my health and my fellow workers' health as well. It should be closed down, it should be cleaned properly, and we should be working in an environment we can't even get gloves from the machine.
Grocery store delivery app Instacart also staged a protest Monday to demand better worker protections and hazard pay. In other New York City news, beloved transgender advocate Lorena Borjas has died after contracting COVID-19 at the age of 59. Originally from Mexico, Borjas has been called the mother of the transgender Latinx community in New York and fought tirelessly for the rights and well-being of LGBTQ people, immigrant communities, and sex workers. Lorena Borjas started a mutual aid fund for members of the transgender community who were suffering financial hardship during the pandemic. Also in New York, world-renowned neurosurgeon Dr. James Goodrich has died from complications of COVID-19. Dr. Goodrich treated countless children with neurological diseases and was well known for his surgical work separating conjoined twins. Tributes poured in Monday from colleagues at the Montefiore Medical Center and the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, where he taught. In Philadelphia, at least 100 protesters shut down traffic, parking their cars in the middle of city streets surrounding City Hall and other government buildings to demand Philadelphia release nonviolent prisoners and immigrant prisoners in light of the pandemic. In New Jersey, families with loved ones imprisoned at Bergen County Jail held a demonstration Friday outside the jail to demand Governor Phil Murphy free all immigrants in detention. In Michigan, Ford Motor Company and General Electric will produce 50,000 ventilators over the next 100 days to help fulfill the dire need for the life-saving device at hospitals across the country. The companies say they can produce 30,000 units per month as long as hospitals need them. The announcement came as GE workers in Massachusetts staged a protest to demand the facility where they work, which normally manufactures jet engines, start producing ventilators and rehire thousands of recently laid-off workers. GE announced last week it was firing 10% of its domestic aviation workforce due to staggering losses experienced by the airline industry because of the coronavirus pandemic. In Florida, the pastor of a megachurch in Tampa Bay was arrested for refusing to cancel massive church services in violation of emergency orders against public gatherings. The Hillsborough County Sheriff said Pastor Rodney Howard Brown demonstrated a, quote, reckless disregard for human life. Federal judges have struck down recent abortion bans that Texas and Ohio enacted as part of their response to the coronavirus pandemic by claiming abortions are non-essential procedures. Judge Lee Yackel said, quote, regarding a woman's right to a pre-fetal viability abortion, the Supreme Court has spoken clearly. There can be no outright ban on such a procedure, he said. Some 7,300 Peace Corps volunteers who were recalled amidst the pandemic are now facing steep challenges, including unemployment, the loss of a regular stipend, as well as housing and health care benefits, as they readjust to life back in the United States. They were all fired. The first known death of a U.S. military member from coronavirus was reported Monday. At least 600 cases have been reported among members of the military. He was from New Jersey. The Justice Department and the Securities and Exchange Commission have launched a joint investigation after several lawmakers sold off stocks after they received privileged briefings about the coronavirus pandemic's threat to the economy. The FBI has also contacted Republican Senator Richard Burr for information about the transactions. In other news from Capitol Hill, Mark Meadows resigned as a North Carolina Congressmember Monday to officially start his new position today as President Trump's chief of staff. As coronavirus cases surge across the country, infectious disease and medical experts are developing new theories about the spread of the disease and its manifestations. In Washington state, a gathering of asymptomatic choir singers earlier this month resulted in dozens of cases of COVID-19, including 2 deaths. Scientists say it was likely passed through the air, refuting earlier studies that say contagion via aerosolized particles is highly unlikely. Meanwhile, cardiologists are warning that some COVID-19 patients have worse cardiac symptoms than respiratory ones, in some cases mimicking a heart attack. Spain reported over 800 new deaths Monday as authorities called for a period of nationwide hibernation. Spain has now surpassed China in cases, reaching nearly 88,000. This includes over 12,000 healthcare workers infected. The director of Emergency Health Services has also tested positive. Anti-fascist activist, former political prisoner, José María Galante, known as Chato Galante, has died from coronavirus. Chato fought against the dictatorship of Francisco Franco and belonged to the Revolutionary Communist League. He was arrested and tortured multiple times under Franco. Galante was featured in the acclaimed Oscar-nominated 2018 documentary The Silence of Others. In Hungary, critics warn authoritarian anti-immigrant Prime Minister Viktor Orban is using the crisis to pass sweeping new laws to further consolidate his power, allowing him to rule by decree and giving him authority to override existing legislation, prevent elections, and arrest and jail journalists that may be critical of his nationalist government and their response to the pandemic. In Italy, the death toll has topped 11,000, with confirmed cases nearing 102,000. But Italian officials have also reported Italy experienced the lowest daily case count in 2 weeks, raising hopes that the country is slowly flattening the curve of infections. In Germany, 17 people have died at a nursing home in the city of Wolfsburg, where the majority of the city's 145 confirmed coronavirus cases come from elderly residents living at the facility. In France, health authorities reported a new daily high Monday with more than 400 coronavirus deaths, bringing the total death toll to more than 3,000. In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is entering into quarantine after an aide tested positive for COVID-19. Netanyahu is expected to agree on an emergency unity government with rival Benny Gantz amid the coronavirus outbreak, in a blow to many who hope to see Netanyahu lose political power after failing to win recent elections. In Afghanistan, authorities began releasing hundreds of prisoners as a part of an effort to limit outbreaks of the coronavirus. Up to 10,000 older prisoners could be freed. Afghanistan has reported over 170 cases and 4 deaths. In other news from Afghanistan, at least 28 Afghan soldiers were killed in Taliban attacks across the country in recent days, postponing the release of around 100 Taliban prisoners. In Nicaragua, fears are mounting that a devastating outbreak could overwhelm the health system as the government of President Daniel Ortega has neglected to put in place proper mitigation measures, encouraging political rallies and other gatherings. Only 4 known cases have been reported thus far. In El Salvador, thousands gathered outside a government building in the capital, San Salvador, Monday to demand the $300 government checks President Bukele promised to some 1.5 million households who work as street vendors and other jobs in the informal economy. El Salvador has been on a nationwide lockdown for nearly 2 weeks. In Mexico, the government declared a health emergency Monday and issued stricter rules aimed at stemming the spread of COVID-19 after cases nationwide topped 1,000 and the death toll is nearing 30 people. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has come under fire for flouting social distancing guidelines and attending rallies and other crowded public events. In India, footage has surfaced of health workers hosing migrant workers with disinfectant as they try to make their way home following a nationwide lockdown announced last week. Many migrants have reported harrowing journeys home following the order, including several reports of deaths along the way. Across Asia, places that have successfully stabilized coronavirus outbreaks, such as China, Hong Kong, and Singapore, now fear tourists who begin traveling back to these places will trigger a second wave of outbreaks. China, Hong Kong, and Singapore have all barred foreign travelers from entering to stem the spread of coronavirus. In South Africa, a police officer was arrested for allegedly killing a man who violated recently enacted lockdown measures. The man was reportedly shot to death on Sunday after a group of police officers followed him home from a bar. Zimbabwe has embarked on a 21-day coronavirus lockdown. This is Harare resident.
Our issue is that the people were not given enough time to prepare because the majority of these people survive from hand to mouth. So when it was announced, most people did not have enough money. So in the meantime, people will not have food to eat. And we are so afraid as to how we will survive by the time 21 days have passed.
Back in the United States, Democratic presidential candidate, former Vice President Joe Biden, has doubled down on his rejection of single-payer health care as the coronavirus pandemic has already created record levels of unemployment, which is costing many their employer-sponsored health care, and millions of Americans face economic devastation. This is Joe Biden speaking on MSNBC.
Single payer will not solve that at all. The thing that is needed is, for example, we have a whole number of hospitals that are being so stretched, including rural hospitals, they're going to need more financing. That doesn't come from a single payer system. That comes from the federal government stepping up and dealing with the concerns that they have.
Exit polls at primary voting sites show Democrats largely favor a single payer system such as Medicare for All, including in conservative states. As the coronavirus pandemic rages on, a number of states have quietly passed laws to criminalize protests against the fossil fuel industry. Kentucky, South Dakota, West Virginia recently approved new laws imposing harsh penalties, including jail time, on protest actions that damage or block so-called critical infrastructure, such as pipelines that are used for the production and transport of fossil fuels. In media news, Gannett, which owns USA Today, has announced it's cutting pay and furloughing workers after a major loss in advertising revenue amidst the economic downturn spurred by the pandemic. Meanwhile, the Tampa Bay Times said it's reducing its print publication to just 2 days per week and is furloughing workers during the crisis. In Idaho, Republican Governor Brad Little signed into law 2 bills attacking the rights of transgender people. One measure prohibits transgender people from amending their birth certificates to reflect their gender identity. The other bars trans women and girls from playing on sports teams aligned with their gender identity. The anti-trans bills were signed on the eve of the International Transgender Day of Visibility, which is today. Rights groups have vowed to challenge the legislation. And the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe said it will fight back after the Trump administration announced its reservation would be disestablished and it would lose its land trust status. Trump's move will halt plans to build a casino which would have competed with nearby casinos in Rhode Island that have well-established ties to Trump. And one clarification from earlier, New York Congressmember Nydia Velázquez announced Monday she's been diagnosed with presumed coronavirus infection, but it's unclear if she's tested positive. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States, New York City. And I'm joined by my co-host Juan Gonzalez, who it's wonderful to see through a virtual medium, joining us from home, from the number 2 state in the country. That is New Jersey, joining us from New Brunswick, where he teaches at Rutgers University. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and greetings to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world as we do our best to maneuver through this terrible pandemic and as we try to chronicle the responses from government officials and the public health community, and most importantly, as we seek to expose the inevitable attempts by the worst elements of our society to exploit and profit from the crisis.
Well, When we come back, we're going to Michigan. We'll be joined by a doctor, by an epidemiologist, by a man who ran for governor and was the former head of the Detroit Health Department to talk about, well, what looks like is one of the major hot spots in this country, Detroit, Michigan, and the state of health care in this country in the midst of the pandemic. Stay with us.
Suscita d'amore, poiché quell'occhio al cuore onnipotente va. Viviamo, amore, amor fra i qualici più caldi baci avrà. Tra voi saprò
singing in their homes, in one case in the shower, as part of a national campaign encouraging people to slow the spread of the coronavirus during the lockdown by sheltering at home. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman, broadcasting from the epicenter of the pandemic in New York, co-hosting Juan Gonzalez, broadcasting from his home in New Brunswick, New Jersey, to stop community spread. Monday marked the deadliest day of the pandemic in the United States, with more than 500 deaths reported. The total death toll in the United States has now passed 3,100, a number that's tripled since just Thursday. Medical workers are bracing for that number to soar in the coming weeks. In New York State, the current epicenter of the pandemic, the peak of the crisis expected to come around April 10th, when one study estimates 827 people will die of the virus in a single day. More than 1,200 people here in New York have already died. In Michigan, a growing hotspot for the virus, the death toll is expected to peak a day after New York, with 164 deaths on April 11th. Nearly 200 people have died already in Michigan as the city of Detroit prepares for a swell of cases. Michigan State Representative Isaac Robinson died of the virus in a Detroit medical center Sunday. He was only 44 years old. Detroit's police commissioner has tested positive for the virus, and 500 officers are in quarantine. Detroit's hospital system is already overwhelmed. The city has high rates of asthma and chronic illness. Meanwhile, President Trump has repeatedly attacked Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who's calling on the federal government to offer more medical supplies and who is expected to shutter the state schools for the remainder of the school year by the end of this week. They're already closed, but to announce they would be closed for good for this semester. Well, for more, we are joined by the former director of the Detroit Health Department, recent candidate for governor of Michigan, Abdul El-Sayed. He's a physician, an epidemiologist. He's the author of Healing Politics, A Doctor's Journey into the Heart of Our Political Epidemic, the book just out today. His recent piece in The Guardian headlined, Coronavirus is Exploiting an Underlying Condition, Our Epidemic of Insecurity. And thanks so much for joining us, Doctor, from your home, again, to protect your family, yourself, and community spread, how critical this is. Can you talk overall? I mean, every time I see President Trump talking about that woman, meaning the governor of Michigan, saying he told Vice President Pence not to call her because he doesn't like her. Also talked about the governor of Washington State as well, talking about him as a terrible person. And yet your governor continues to say things like they had just gotten a federal shipment. And she said, this shipment is not enough for one shift at one hospital in my state. Talk about the state of Michigan, Dr. Abdul El-Sayed.
Well, let me tell you, first of all, thank you for having me today. What we're seeing here is just an utter lapse in federal leadership. It's clear that the individual in the White House sees himself more as the head of a political party whose job it is to divide the country between himself and leaders in other states, while you've got governors in places like Michigan or Washington or New York who realize the depth of the responsibility right now. Michigan is a state with 10 million people. It's one of the most diverse states in the country, but also we've had this very devastating history of what has been a level of leadership that has taken from communities like Detroit to pass tax cuts for major corporations across the state. And when you think about the movement of a pathogen like coronavirus, it's easy to just focus on the pathogen. But epidemiologists think not just about the pathogen, but also about the host and about the environment. And what we've seen is an interplay between the host and the environment that's left people in communities like Detroit fundamentally vulnerable to this disease. And that's why we're seeing the spikes that we're seeing now. And in the absence of federal leadership to coordinate the response, we're seeing suffering that didn't have to happen.
And Dr. El-Sayed, you've talked often that this is not just a question of the epidemic of COVID-19 itself, but that there's also an epidemic of insecurity in the country. Could you expand on that?
That's right. I spent 18 months touring my state, and I had thought that when I walked into my campaign that the challenges that people faced in places like Detroit or Flint had to be different than the ones they faced in places like Petoskey or Kalkaska. And then I toured the state. And as an epidemiologist, my job is to understand patterns in disease, how disease moves between people. And one of the most interesting but also inspiring things that I found was that people were talking about the same set of issues. Why water is so expensive in a state that's defined by its fresh water, while corporations like Nestle can bottle unlimited amounts of water for $400 a year. Why our education system is being corporatized and profiteered off of by people like Betsy DeVos. Why it is that people still can't get health care in the richest, most powerful country in the world. And what I realize is that all of us are living in this system that has moved more of the means of wealth off to the very top, leaving all the rest of us, whether it's because of health care or housing or an insecure gig job in a gig economy or the porous barrier between corporations and government, has left us fundamentally insecure. And that insecurity has consequences for all of us in some pretty profound ways. It's what's left us so vulnerable as a society to this. You know, when we talk in the United States, when we say we're number one, usually we mean that to be a good thing. But it shouldn't mean that we're number one in the case burden of a global pandemic. And that's what we're seeing right now. And unfortunately, that was written for us well before this pandemic hit, because if it wasn't this, it might have been a climate event. And we are, as a society, ill prepared for these things because our people are unfortunately living at the slippery edge of our economy, and because we have torn our public service and our public infrastructure apart to sell it to the highest bidder.
And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned President Trump, and we've been watching now day after day as the president has his daily press briefings in the evening just before the 6 o'clock news is getting ready to start. And he brings a parade of corporate CEOs, one after another, calling them all by first names. I don't know if that's because he's on a first name basis with all of them or he just can't remember their last names, but he brings them up one after another. Yet we've seen very few health professionals. The people, you're a doctor yourself, a public health professional, none of the, except for the top people at NIH and at the Centers for Disease Control, we're not seeing any of the doctors and nurses and people who are on the front lines fighting this disease. I'm wondering what your reaction to that is.
Yeah, we are suffering a public health emergency, not a private health emergency, but it's rather clear that this is part and parcel of the kind of leadership that unfortunately conservatives and Republicans have offered for a very long time, which is to say that the best way to respond to a public crisis is not to empower the government infrastructure that's intended to solve it, like, say, the CDC or HHS or any of the infrastructure that's focused on public health, but instead to bring in corporate CEOs as private solutions to the problem, almost to point at government and say, well, that's why we failed, is because we failed to privatize the South. Fact of the matter is, though, is that the reason we are suffering where we are, right, is because we have gutted the public health infrastructure in this country. If you look at the state and local level, we've seen a 45% drop in public health funding over the past 15 years. The CDC has had its budgets proposed to be cut every year of the Trump presidency. In fact, they were proposing to cut the 2021 budget, which they're negotiating right now in the middle of this pandemic. We need a public response. And what Donald Trump is saying is that he doesn't believe in the government that he leads to solve it. And meanwhile, because of the failure of federal leadership across the country, you've got governors and mayors competing against each other for resources we should have had stockpiled. We should have been ready for this. And one last point about this. When you look at a pandemic, it's not like a hurricane. It's not like when it forms, you can't do anything about it and you just got to be ready. The thing about a pandemic is that it starts small, and it's almost like a fire. If you put it out when it's in your toaster, you won't be fighting it when it's in your house. And if you put it out when it's in your house, you won't be fighting it when it's taking over the neighborhood. Unfortunately, right now, it's almost like we've taken the battery out of the fire alarms. We have told all the fire houses to go home. And then when this thing is raging in our neighborhoods, we're wondering why it's happening. And everybody's left to themselves to try and put out their own fire. And that's why we've seen such a massive failure in the response federally.
Like a few weeks ago, in other newspapers, of course, as well, that running water will be temporarily restored to thousands of poor Detroit residents disconnected due to unpaid bills. Disconnected to the water supply of Detroit. Amidst an outcry about the public health threat posed by the pandemic, at least 141,000 Detroit households were disconnected since 2014 as part of a widely condemned debt collection program, according to records obtained by The Bridge news magazine. Just last year, taps were turned off in more than 23,000 homes, 3/5 of which were still without water by mid-January. So can you talk about the significance of saying they're temporarily being rehooked up? Because you so well describe in your book the way this pandemic has exposed the fissures of inequality and health inequality in this country.
Yeah, when you look at communities that are suffering the most, they're communities on which environmental injustice, structural racism, and their implications on poverty have already softened the space for the incoming of this virus to devastate people. You know, you think about something like water. The fact that a mayor or a governor have to be thinking about turning water back on suggests that they're already playing from the back foot, because water should already be on. It should never have been turned off. It's one of the most frustrating things about the system of corporate capitalism in communities like Michigan, because what we do is we, in effect, ask poor people to pay exorbitant rates for basic things like water, to pay off debts that governments well before them incurred. You know, look at the situation in Detroit. The reason that people had their water shut off is because during the municipal bankruptcy in the city of Detroit, which, by the way, had a lot more to do with white flight and the resulting loss of a tax base, during that municipal bankruptcy, it was agreed upon that Detroit had to pay debts for their water authority that, in effect, had actually purified water for the entire region. So Detroiters were literally having to pay back the debt that the entire region incurred because Detroit was the single utility purifying water for everybody. And then they just raised rates, and when people couldn't pay them, they just shut off people's water. You think about the logic of this, right? And the realization that water should just be a human right for people. It should just be there for people. And then you fast forward and you think about the incoming pandemic, and we're telling people to wash their hands with warm soapy water for 20 seconds. Well, if you don't have water in your house, you can't do that. All of that is seeded by decisions that have been made that have been patterned around race and patterned around wealth for a very long time. And that's why I talk about this epidemic of insecurity as being what laid the groundwork for the incoming pandemic. And if it wasn't a pandemic like this, it might have been a climate event. But we are not well situated to be able to handle these challenging circumstances that we're going to see pitched at us. And it's the reason why we have to build a robust federal government that can take these things on and prevent them when they're small, and more importantly, build the kind of social infrastructure for people, the kind of social safety net that says that you're not going to be evicted if something bad happens to you, that you're not going to lose your water simply because you can't pay exorbitant rates, that your kid is not going to have to take hundreds of thousands of dollars in loans to go to college, that you can get health care if and when you're sick.
Dr. El-Sayed, I'd like to ask you about that last point, healthcare when you're sick. We just played a headline earlier of Joe Biden talking about why Medicare for all would not have been a solution to the current problem. But the reality is that our healthcare system is this Byzantine world of for-profit hospitals, nonprofit hospitals, some community hospitals, some huge so-called nonprofit chains where the executives make multi-million-dollar salaries. And they're all now competing for resources. If there was a single payer system with some rationale or planning to a process of responding to an epidemic like this, would the situation have been easier to deal with?
Absolutely. There's no doubt. And I just want to explain a couple of reasons why. Number one, the idea that 10% of your population doesn't have health care at all, or another 50% on top of that have a deductible that's so high that they've learned to ignore symptoms like a fever and a dry cough, which, by the way, are the symptoms of COVID-19, because they know that if they do go and seek medical care for those symptoms, that they'll be hit with a bill on the back end. That's a really dangerous state of affairs when you've got an incoming global pandemic. But even beyond that, I just want you to think about the structure of our health system. Hospitals make money in this system on elective surgeries. That's how they get reimbursed from insurance companies. But if you've got a global pandemic that's about to hit your hospital, what's the first thing you cancel? Elective surgeries. And so now you've got hospitals that not only are trying to staff up and be ready for one of the most serious public health crises of our time, but they're also battling bankruptcy on the back end because they've lost their main source of pay. All of that is because the system is run for profit. Here's the other part. We keep hearing about doctors going without PPE, personal protective equipment. And part of the reason why is because I've talked to business consultants who told them that the best way to supply your hospital is what we call just-in-time supplying, meaning you don't want to have a bunch of stuff laying around because you don't know when you're going to use it. That's all overhead you can strip away. But here's the problem. Well, when you're hit with a pandemic, just in time doesn't work because all of a sudden everybody's trying to get the resources that they need. Just in time is a classic page out of a business consulting manual. When you run hospitals like a business, you forget the fact that they're actually supposed to be there to save lives. And the third point is this. There is no incentive for prevention in our system. Why? Because our system makes money on people getting sick, right? You can't actually bill something if somebody does not get sick so that you can bill them for the care. And so if you look at just the way the system is set up, there's very little incentive to talk about prevention. And that's why we keep seeing budgets get cut for institutions like the CDC or local health departments or state health departments because it just doesn't fit within the incentive structure of our health system. Imagine we had a system that actually rewarded keeping people healthy rather than taking care of them after they get sick. That's what Medicare for All would have done. And one last point, we keep hearing this comparison between us and Italy. And since when did we start comparing ourselves with Italy? When was that the comparison? The fact of the matter is Italy is a far smaller country. And even then, we just surpassed them in terms of the number of COVID cases. And it's looking like over the long term, our cases are going to skyrocket well beyond what Italy experienced. We have a responsibility to learn from this moment and realize that we've got to guarantee everybody in this country health care. And if we don't, we will continue to be vulnerable to these kinds of massive public health crises.
Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, we want to thank you so much for being with us. We hope to talk with you at a future point more about your book and your work as an epidemiologist, a physician, former director of the Detroit Health Department. His new book is out today, Healing Politics, a doctor's journey into the heart of our political epidemic. When we come back, an exclusive Democracy Now! TV radio broadcast, we speak with Tara Reid about her allegations against Joe Biden. She says he sexually assaulted her in 1993 when he was a senator and she was his staff. Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. As we turn now to new developments in sexual assault allegations made against presidential candidate Joe Biden. Last week, The Intercept reported Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, set up to help survivors of rape and sexual assault, refused to fund a Me Too investigation into allegations against Biden. The charges were brought by Tara Reade, who worked as a staff assistant for then-Senator Biden in 1993, when she was in her mid-20s. Tara Reade told journalist Katie Halper in an interview published Tuesday that Biden repeatedly touched her without her consent and sexually assaulted her. A warning to listeners and viewers, her account is graphic.
And then his hands were on me and underneath my clothes. And, and then he went down my skirt, but then up inside it. And he penetrated me with his fingers.
Tara Reade approached the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund in January looking for assistance, but was reportedly told the fund couldn't help her because Biden's a candidate for federal office and pursuing a case could jeopardize the fund's nonprofit status. The Intercept reports the public relations firm representing Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is SKD Knickerbocker, whose managing director, Anita Dunn, is a top advisor to Biden's presidential campaign. Democracy Now! Emailed Biden's press team for response to the allegations and to join us on the show, but they didn't respond. Joe Biden's deputy campaign manager, Kate Bedingfield, said in a statement, quote, "Women have a right to tell their story and reporters have an obligation to rigorously vet those claims. We encourage them to do so because these accusations are false," she said. Well, in this exclusive Democracy Now! TV radio broadcast, we're joined now by Tara Reade herself, the former staffer for Joe Biden, who came forward with the allegations that Biden sexually assaulted her in 1993. Tara, welcome to Democracy Now! It is very difficult to go back over something like this, but if you wouldn't mind telling us about how you came to decide at this point that it was important for you to tell your story. You had come forward last year when others talked about Senator Joe Biden, the former vice president, the presidential candidate, being sexually inappropriate with them. But you didn't go as far as to tell this story that happened in 1993. So why don't you tell us what happened?
I actually tried to tell the story to some extent in 1993, in the sense that I wanted to talk about it, but I was too afraid. My mother had encouraged me to file a police report, and I did not, and I should have. So I filed a sexual harassment claim, or just I filled out a paper and then did not hear back.
Can you give us the circumstances, how you ended up, what was the day, how you ended up alone with Joe Biden? Explain what happened that day.
I was approached by my supervisor. She handed me a gym bag and said, "Hurry, Joe wants this, so get it to him. He's meet you down towards the Capitol." And I went down the stairs, and I don't remember exactly where I was because there's connections between the Russell Building and all of that and the corridors. But we were in a semi-private location. It wasn't a room. It wasn't the Russell office building. It was, his office. It was down in the corridors. And I handed him the gym bag. And then it was one, as I described, fluid moment. He was talking to me, and he said some things that I don't recall. And I was up against the wall, and I remember the coldness of the wall. And I remember his hands underneath my blouse and underneath my skirt, and his fingers penetrating me as he was trying to kiss me, and I was pulling away. And he pulled back, and he said, "Come on, man, I heard you liked me." But he was angry. It was like a tight voice. And he tended to smile when he was angry. And he isn't like the Uncle Joe like everybody talks about now. He was younger. He was my dad's age at that time and very strong. And he looked insulted and angry. And I remember feeling like I had done something wrong when he said that statement. And then I was standing there when he said, he was still near me. He said, pointed his finger and said, "You're nothing to me. You're nothing." And he walked away. And I don't remember exactly where I went after. I think I went to the restroom to clean up, but I don't remember precisely. The next memory I have is sitting on the cold stairs in the Russell Building back stairs where the big windows are. And I remember just my whole body shaking. And I remember knowing that I had made him angry and that my career was probably over. And I didn't comply. And I didn't comply when I was asked to serve drinks at a cocktail party for donors, because apparently Joe Biden said, according to a legislative staffer, that I had pretty legs and he thought I was pretty and I should serve the drinks. And my supervisor had encouraged me to do so, and I did not. So sitting on those stairs, the reality hit me. The next thing I remember was that night and talking to my mom, and she was like, "You need to file a police report. It's a sexual assault." And I didn't think of it as sexual assault, and I didn't really understand. And I was trying to just get over the shock of it because I looked up to him. He was supposed to be a champion of women. And I was so thrilled to be at that office and so honored. And it shattered my life and changed the trajectory of my whole career in life. And I lost my job after I complained, and I was fired.
And how exactly did you complain, Tara? You filed a complaint of sexual harassment against Senator Biden at the time. Now, let's be clear. This is 1993, 2 years after he led the Senate Judiciary Committee around the Anita Hill charges against Clarence Thomas. So this is soon after that. You filed a complaint. Did you talk about this happening?
No, I didn't talk about the sexual assault. What I did was I went through office protocol, which would be to go to your supervisor. And if you're not happy, you go to the next supervisor. And then the next one would be the chief of staff. And I did go up the chain verbally. And there were a couple of meetings, more than a couple, actually. And there were people taking notes. I mean, I know they took notes. And some were more informal in the hallway with Marianne. And I was basically, after I had not served the drinks, that whole, episode, I was immediately told, like within a few days, by Marianne's assistant, that I dressed too provocatively, that I needed to, be less noticeable. And then Marianne got me in the hallway because I was annoyed by that. And she said, you want to just keep your head down and do as you're told if you want to last here. And I went to them and told them I was uncomfortable. So I couched it in those terms. We didn't use the term sexual harassment a lot back then. And I remember saying I was uncomfortable and why, but nothing happened. And in fact, I was put in a windowless office and I had my duties taken away from me. I was given a desk audit. I was told to call one of my upper level supervisors, even if I went to the restroom. I was not to call or talk to other staffers or go to legislative hearings. I was told that I was given a month to find another job. And I sent out my resumes. And before I did that, because of this retaliation, I told my mother, who gave me the term retaliation and explained to me what was happening, and said to march in there and file a sexual harassment claim. And I said, and she used the word, and I said, well, you don't just march into their office. Like, that's not how this is done. So I had gone through that protocol. Then when that didn't work, I went to the outside, which was like they had a temporary office set up. So it was a Senate personnel or something like that. And I was given a clipboard. I filled out a form and talked about just the incident of the sexual harassment, feeling uncomfortable. And I was told at the window that somebody would call back, call me back in, and they never did. I ended up looking for work, couldn't find it. I volunteered for the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial. I was fortunate enough to work in the VIP tent and with the family, and it was It was helping me emotionally because I was trying to recover from the trauma of what had happened that day. And I didn't share it with many people at all at that time. It's just not something that was easy to talk about. It's not easy to talk about now. And when I came out in April, I started again. I had the intent to tell the whole history with Biden. But one of the first questions out of the reporter's mouth was, yeah, but it wasn't sexual, right? When he was talking about the sexual harassment. And it shut me down. And that's not his fault. That's my responsibility, I know, to be brave and to be courageous and say the words. But it just put me off from being able to talk. And then when the story was hitting, there was so much blowback and smearing on social media that I just didn't feel comfortable. So I was trying to find a way to tell my story to a legitimate news agency. I didn't want it sold or sensationalized or anything nonsense like that. I wanted to have the deeper conversation of how hard it is for survivors of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace to go up against powerful men. Because I have not received any payment for this. I have not received any compensation, because the facts are, women are not paid to talk. They're paid to stay silent. And so I wanted a women's organization around me, and that's why I went to Time's Up.
And Tara Reade, could you talk about your experience then with Time's Up when you went to them and you were hoping that they might be able to assist you in this?
Yes. I went to Time's Up. They were very gracious. I filled out a form, first of all, you do it on the online. And then I was called about January 24th-ish, right around there, and emailed back. And then we had a phone interview. There's about 20 emails between us. And there were several meetings on the phone. And what they did was they prepared a paragraph describing my case. And they were going to give me attorney referrals. And if you're economically challenged or you need help with funds, they will help you with a public relations platform for 1 month. So access to a public relations firm to tell your story with their platform, and also to have an attorney, which is what I was seeking because of the social media smears. I wanted cease and desist for some of the things that were being said. I wanted protection of some sort and not to be alone.
And describe then what happened. I mean, this report in The Intercept of you waiting to hear from Time's Up and then what you learned afterwards about its links to the Biden campaign through the PR firm.
It was absolutely stunning. And the 20-plus emails and the multiple conversations that we had, not one time, not once, did they say that they were connected to Anita Dunn, who worked for Harvey Weinstein and advised him and helped him keep silence some of the women that came forward. Not one time did they talk about the payments that were made to the Joe Biden campaign. Now, bear in mind, in their defense, they said that that's second removed. But part of their services was to provide a platform, a social, a public relations platform. I don't understand, as a survivor, and I'm not an investigative reporter, I'm not an investigator, I'm just speaking as a survivor. It violated my trust when I read Ryan Grimm's article. I found out with everyone else, and I'm still processing that. I shared my story with them again and again, with the attorneys that they sent to me, and each time I was rejected by each attorney. One attorney said, we've met as a firm, and we have decided there is no legal strategy to safely tell your story because it's Joe Biden. And what I want to say is that's wrong. That's unconscionable. Anyone who has a claim or an assertion of something that's happened, of misconduct, should be able to speak freely without reprisal. And as you can see in the social media, I am being ripped apart. I've had my family and my friends contacted I've had my bankruptcy posted. I have had the fact that I had a name change, which was sealed, and a sealed Social Security change for safety, because I'm a domestic violence survivor. And I've been dragged through it, but I don't care. I don't care about that. They can try to strip away everything about me, but they won't take my dignity, and they won't get my silence, because all that does is make me more determined to tell my story, and it doesn't change the fact of what happened in 1993.
And Tara Reade, throughout all this time, when you were engaged in discussions with the Time's Up folks, they never mentioned their relationship with Anita Dunn, and how did they finally notify you that they could not be involved?
They started an email, but then I called Ellie asking her what was going on. It was taking some time, and I kept getting rejected by attorneys. And she said, I was going to just email you, but I have to tell you that our 501c3 status would be at risk. We can keep referring attorneys to you, but we cannot provide you funding. So then I wanted to escalate it to the director. And so we had a meeting with the director and the program manager, and I pushed back a little, and I said, I can't help who did this. Where do I go? How do I get help? How do I get a women's organization to help me? And her response was, keep in communications with us. Our attorneys that have advised us our 501c3 could be at risk because it's the presidential election, and we can't appear biased. So I accepted that response at that time.
We have 5 seconds, Tara.
Anyway, what I would say is there's been no access to justice for me. And in the fall, there's no democracy for me.
Tara Reade, I want to thank you so much for being with us, former staff assistant to then-Senator Joe Biden. She alleges that Joe Biden sexually assaulted her in 1993. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Produced by an amazing group of people. Mike Burke, Dina Guster, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tommy Warnoff, Libby Rainey. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.